Well, it's a delight to be able to introduce our first speaker at the conference, and special delight to be able to introduce a good friend, a longtime colleague, and one's doctoral advisor. So wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Professor Bill Schniedewind is the professor of Hebrew Bible and Northwest Semitics at UCLA, author of numerous books and articles, and most recently, who really wrote the Bible, the story of the scribes. So without further ado.
Well, thank you again for being here. It's really a privilege to be giving this talk. And just to let you know, I'm the only speaker this morning for the first session, because our other speaker, Sarah Emanuel, will be speaking tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, I believe. So we had to adjust the schedule. That made me feel like I could just go on and on, because now I haven't. No, it did mean that last night, I didn't need to frantically cut a couple pages from because I didn't have to worry if I was going to go over, 4 or 5 minutes. I always tell my students that when you go to a conference and you give a paper, nobody gets mad if your paper is a minute short, but they get really pissed if your paper is 2 minutes long. But I hope you'll give me some latitude this morning, and if it goes a minute or two long. All right. Why was the Book of Esther written in Hebrew? Typically, the Book of Esther is understood as diaspora literature, written in the diaspora and for the diaspora. In the words of an article by Shlomo Goitin, Esther is an exilic book written in the exile for the exile. Other scholars like Michael Fox and Adele Berlin suggest that the book was likely written in a diaspora community, although they make no explicit claims. Edward Greenstein also argues that the book reflects the diaspora situation and addresses the needs of Judeans living in the diaspora. In the same way, John Levinson argues that the book was probably of diaspora origin. Lee Humphreys labels the book as lifestyle for the diaspora. In short, there's a wide consensus that the Book of Esther was likely written in the diaspora for the diaspora. But if this was the case, why was the Book of Esther written in Hebrew? Hebrew was the language of no Persian or Hellenistic diaspora community. One major dissenting voice here has been Elsie Stern, who suggested that a Jerusalem setting for its composition and offered literary and cultural explanations for why the Book of Esther would be suitable in the context of the Persian period. In her article, Esther and the Politics of Diaspora, Stern explores how Esther's position in the Persian Empire can be read as a metaphor for the complex relationships between the Jewish people and the broader societies they inhabit. She points out how the idea of the exile can be understood both as a physical and a symbolic state, highlighting how Jewish communities have navigated their identities in foreign lands. From this perspective, Stern argues that it is no longer necessary to situate the Book of Esther as a diaspora composition. Esther's role in the Persian court can be a symbol of Jewish resilience, even in Persian Yehud, emphasizing how the story reflects tensions between assimilation and maintaining religious and cultural identity. These are issues that are certainly at play in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The political dimension is also key, as the narrative offers insights to how the Jewish people have historically dealt with power structures, persecution, and strategies for survival. In sum, Stern's analysis brings the experience of Jewish communities in both the diaspora and in the land, and she points to the ongoing negotiation of power, identity, and survival, both in foreign lands and in Persian Yehud. In this paper, I want to offer some anthropological linguistic arguments as well as historical arguments to further support Stern's literary reading of the Book of Esther as a composition written in Jerusalem, probably in the late Persian period. The framework for my thinking arises out of my recent book, Who Really Wrote the Bible? The Story of the Scribes. But I have to admit that I intentionally ignored the Book of Esther in tracing the history of scribal communities in this book. It wasn't really a major concern for for the thesis of my book, but this conference has allowed me to reconsider this problem of why Esther was written in Hebrew more carefully. In Who Really Wrote the Bible, I argued that ancient Israelite literacy was acquired as a skill for professions, such as a priest like Ezra or an administrator like Nehemiah. I demonstrated that scribal skills were learned through apprenticeship for their respective professions. Such apprenticeship learning created small, close-knit communities. The main Hebrew scribal community in Persian Yehud was a priestly community centered around the Jerusalem temple. The Book of Esther, however, doesn't fit into such a community. But I also argued that there was a second scribal community, namely the Achaemenid administrators working in Yehud, people like Nehemiah. In my opinion, the Book of Esther fits perfectly within such a scribal community. But let me begin by outlining a little of the evidence for the language of the diaspora communities and the problem with those settings. Some limited evidence for the survival of Hebrew scribalism in the Mesopotamian diaspora has surfaced, for example, in the archives of Al Yehudu. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because we have James Moore here, and who has been working on these archives more intensively. But the Al Yehudu tablets are a corpus of cuneiform tablets that date between 572 BC and 477 BC. The first volume of these texts were published by Laurie Pierce and Cornelia Wunsch. There's a second volume now, and James Moore has an excellent chapter summarizing the evidence for 3 Hebrew and 16 Aramaic epigraphs. On this basis, Moore suggests that at the dawn of the Persian rule in Mesopotamia, the Judean community in Al Yehudu switched its local administration from a Hebrew to an Aramaic scribal culture. I mostly agree with this, but I probably would word it slightly different. I would suggest that the Hebrew scribal culture there was largely a legacy from Judah, and that the scribal culture had already shifted in the Neo-Babylonian period to Aramaic. Let me illustrate from one of the best known of the archive. This is a tablet with a Hebrew name inscribed on the side you see here in red. It is an important, first of all, to recognize that this is a cuneiform record, right? Not a Hebrew record or an Aramaic record. Tablet 10, with the Hebrew name Shlemiah or Shlemaiah, is written on the side of a cuneiform administrative tablet that was a promissory note for barley. Here it is, a translation of it. The tablet dates to the 6th year of Nabonidus, the king of Babylon. This would be around 550 BC. That is, this would be about 36 years after the second Babylonian exile and the destruction of Jerusalem. The other 2 epigraphs are earlier. They date to 572 BC and 567 BC. That is, plausibly within the first generation of the Babylonian exile. James Moore seems to suggest that Shlemiah is a second-generation exile, but it is also conceivable that he could be within the first generation of the exiles to Babylon. The vocalization of his Hebrew name as Shalamiah is based on the cuneiform version of this text, which can be transcribed as Shalom Yama. This Hebrew name is known in the Bible and in the inscriptional record at Rod and seals in various places. And the biblical name is vocalized as Shelem Yah or Shelem Yahu. The biblical vocalization is probably to be derived from a PL verbal form, Shelem Yahu. The Akkadian vocalization in the cuneiform, however, seems to be based on local linguistic adaptations of the Hebrew name, either by the influence, you could say, of Akkadian or Aramaic. What is clear, I think, in the cuneiform version of the name is that a first step of linguistic assimilation has already taken place. Now, the evidence of Hebrew in the Al-Yahudu documents is admittedly limited, but it does suggest what we would expect from, based on linguistic anthropological studies of language change and death. Namely, the first generation of a displaced people often retains the language of the homeland. It is the second and third generation where language death occurs. It is not surprising then that the much later Babylonian Marashu archive, let's see, I think I put an example of this. There are no longer any traces of Hebrew in that scribal community. There are some traditional Judean names in the Marashu archive, but there is no evidence for the continuing use of Hebrew. Not surprising, you have Aramaic. This is an Aramaic epigraph in the Marashu archive. The other texts that might be relevant for Hebrew scribalism in Babylon are the ration tablets from Babylon. There were 290 tablets excavated near the Ishtar Gate in the 1930s. These tablets date from 595 BC to 570 BC. 4 tablets mention the Judean royal family, and most importantly, the men of Judah. You see here in the last line of my translation. Who are these men of Judah? It seems likely that they were affiliated with the Judean court. It's also reasonable to assume that the men of Judah had scribal skills that were related to their work in the royal court. But again, these possible Hebrew scribes were the first generation of exiles. It is difficult to imagine what social infrastructure and support there would have been for a later generation of exile Hebrew scribes in Babylon. Indeed, I would argue that we currently have no evidence that there was a scribal infrastructure for continuing Hebrew scribalism after the first generation of exiles. Hebrew scribalism, if it continued to exist in Babylon, would have to rely on the Aramaic administrative infrastructure. But this seems unlikely. Moreover, it is difficult to imagine how a Hebrew composition in Babylonia would have made its way to Jerusalem. Here I would agree with James Moore again, who observes that, quote, while a Judean in one part of the empire may have had a vague concept that Judeans existed in other parts of the empire, it's safe to assume that the two communities did not know each other. In other words, there was no infrastructure for a Babylonian composition for Esther, and there is no vector of transmission wherein such a Hebrew composition makes its way to Jerusalem and then gets adopted by the Jerusalem scribal community. No, the only context for composition and transmission for the Book of Esther in the Persian province is the Persian province of Yehud, specifically in Jerusalem. Even in the Persian province of Yehud, the very survival of Hebrew requires some explanation. Language shift from Hebrew to Aramaic in the southern Levant was already beginning in the 6th century BC. We can acknowledge this on the basis of demographic changes. As William Labov noted in his classic work on language change, demographic changes in a community are the central factor in determining the course of linguistic change. Archaeological surveys have suggested as much as an 85% decrease in the population of Yehud after the Babylonian invasions and destructions of Jerusalem. Here you see this laid out in a chart from Avi Faust's book, Judah in the Neo-Babylonian Period, The Archaeology of Desolation. Although some villages show continued settlement after the Babylonian invasions and presumably might have continued to speak their native Hebrew language, the majority of cities and villages ceased to be settled in the Babylonian period. The new villages and cities that emerged during the Persian period would have been Aramaic speaking. Even though the population figures are difficult to estimate for antiquity, the demographic changes in the southern Levant after the Babylonian invasions were certainly profound. It is quite clear that during this period, the Judean people living in the Persian province of Yehud lost, to some extent, their historical Hebrew vernacular language. Likewise, there was no larger social infrastructure to support Hebrew scribalism, even in Persian Yehud. Judean towns largely adopted the Aramaic language of the Persian Empire, and an Aramaic administrative infrastructure replaced Hebrew. When we look for inscriptional evidence for the use of Hebrew during the Babylonian, Persian, and Hellenistic periods in the southern Levant, it is shockingly meager. There are only a handful of Hebrew inscriptions. Here's one of them. Mostly a few coins and seals until we get to the 3rd century BC. One of the most notable aspects of the few Hebrew inscriptions that we do have is the use of Aramaic script. This change reflects Aramaic scribal training, even though they're writing in Hebrew. The shift from Hebrew to Aramaic on every level was profound and irreversible. As I argued many years ago, one might even say that written Hebrew died, although it would probably be more precise to say that the Hebrew scribal institutions languished. In spite of this, and perhaps because of this, the Hebrew language continued to serve as an emblematic role for social differentiation, political legitimacy, and social identity. The use of Hebrew on coins beginning in the 4th century BC points to an attempt to use Hebrew politically and administratively. It was the priests, in this case, in the coin, that are using Hebrew on these coins, but I think that it presages the broader use of Hebrew in the later Hellenistic and Hasmonean periods. As I mentioned in my recent book, I argued that there were two scribal communities in Yehud during the Persian period. One was the small Hebrew priestly community, narrowly centered in the Jerusalem temple community. The other was an Aramaic scribal community that served the Persian administration. The Aramaic scribal community would have been much more diverse and had a much more diverse geographical footprint. And we have literally thousands of Aramaic inscriptions from the late Persian period and Hellenistic period in Persian Yehud and in the southern Levant. I could have thrown in a couple ostraca from Idumea, for example. Now, my reconstruction here relies on a learning model for scribal training, namely apprenticeship systems. Aramaic scribal training, on the one hand, would have been located in the diverse administrative systems of the Persian Empire. Jerusalem, of course, was only a small node in this infrastructure. And it's important to remember here how small and isolated Jerusalem was in the Persian period. Hebrew scribal training had very little utilitarian function outside of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem and Gerizim temples. For this reason, it's difficult to posit a large or diverse Hebrew scribal community. The Hebrew scribal community essentially served religion in the temple. The Book of Esther shows no sign, however, that it functioned for priestly or a temple community. One of the main problems that scholars face with Esther is that it is clearly not priestly literature. Scholars have noted, for example, that the book lacks any reference to the temple or the land of Israel. It does not use the name of God. These observations have indicated that the book that the book was unlikely to be a Jerusalem temple or a scribal community document. Rather, Esther is a text deeply ensconced in Persian administrative bureaucracy. I would suggest that the Book of Esther served as didactic literature for the non-priestly administrative scribal community in Jerusalem. The primary literary figure that serves for such an example in Jerusalem is the figure of Nehemiah. Based on Nehemiah's own biographical memoir, he was an Achaemenid administrator working in Jerusalem. As such, he would have been trained in Aramaic, but Nehemiah reflects a political ideology for the acquisition of the Hebrew language. Nehemiah notably complains about the lack of Hebrew knowledge. For example, at one point he suggests that half the children spoke the language of Ashdod, that is probably Aramaic, and they could not speak the language of Judah, that is Hebrew. Nehemiah also reflects on this problem in the Torah reading ceremony, where translation of the Torah is required from Hebrew into Aramaic. Finally, the use of Hebrew on coins in the 4th century points to the use of Hebrew for political and not simply religious purposes. It suggests the importance of Hebrew outside the temple and its in the administration. Now, the figure of Nehemiah was not a priest, but he still acquired literacy. So how does Nehemiah learn Hebrew, and why does he learn Hebrew? To answer these questions, it's helpful to understand how he was trained as a scribe. Aramaic would have been the linguistic foundation for his training. Scribes first learned to read and write in Aramaic. This is the reason why Aramaic replaces Hebrew script in the Persian period. Hebrew was a secondary, specialized, and advanced type of scribal training. Aramaic scribal education then would have served as a bridge for Hebrew scribal education. Indeed, both the figures of Nehemiah and Ezra serve as good examples for this. People would learn to read and write in Aramaic. Some would add Hebrew to their literate skills. A good analogy for this learning model is the ancient city of Ugarit. There, scribes learned to read and write in Akkadian, which was the lingua franca of the Near East. After acquiring literacy in Akkadian cuneiform, some scribes added alphabetic Ugaritic language to their skill set. Since they had already acquired literate skills, Ugaritic and Ugaritic is linguistically related, it was relatively easy to add Ugaritic literacy. But most scribes at Ugarit still were just only Akkadian scribes. But this sequence of learning Akkadian and then Ugaritic explains why we find the full array of Akkadian school texts at Ugarit and almost no Ugaritic school texts at Ugarit. Ugaritic literacy was a secondary skill. The same presumably was also true for Hebrew in Jerusalem during the Persian period, especially for the Achaemenid administration. Now, one of the oldest known sources of Aramaic literary texts, and here I'm almost done, it was Achicar, which was used as the primary curricular text for training in the one of the primary curricular texts for training in the administrative chancellery. Beyond Achicar text, there is not much that qualifies as early Aramaic literature that we know of. Aramaic texts are predominantly administrative, reflecting the functional use of Aramaic as an imperial language. The earliest known copy of Achicar was found at Elephantine and dates to the 5th century, but is probably composed at least a century or more earlier. It tells the story of a scribe and a sage by the name of Achicar who served in the Assyrian administration in the days of Esarhaddon. The story was studied and learned by all fledgling scribes. It seems likely that Achicar would have been part of the curriculum for the Hebrew scribal community, since Hebrew scribes would have begun their scribal training by learning Aramaic. So it's not surprising at all that Achicar became a literary template for many other Hebrew works. The vestiges of Achicar can be found in a variety of Second Temple texts. For example, the priest Ezra is a figure who was originally an administrator in a foreign court. The theme extends to the Book of Daniel, where several Judeans are serving in the Babylonian or Persian courts. Nehemiah is also a foreigner in the Persian court. The Nehemiah memoir also features a certain Tobiah, which reminds us of the main character of another Jewish literary work, the Book of Tobit. The Book of Tobit also mentions a scribe named Achicar in its opening chapter. So Tobit borrows the general theme of the story of Achicar, a foreigner working in the imperial court. This theme was localized by Tobit, who now was a Jew working in the foreign court. Tobit was originally composed in Aramaic, probably, I think. No doubt as a local adaptation for training Levantine scribes, but it was also translated into Hebrew, as we learn from a copy found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. An Achaemenid administrative scribal community may get a shout out in Nehemiah 8. There we have a couple short lists embedded in the narrative. First, there is a list of 13 people who stand beside the priestly Ezra as he reads. It's a list that doesn't include any titles that relate them to the priests or the Levites. There is also a second list in the chapter related to a temple and priestly scribal community. The two scribal communities, government and temple scribes, seem to be mentioned together also in chapter 10, which mentions a group of officials, Levites, and priests that draft and sign a covenant contract. In sum, I would argue that Jerusalem was the only place where the Book of Esther could have been written during the Persian or Hellenistic periods. There was no infrastructure or community that would have supported a composition of Esther in the diaspora, and there is no reason for such a diaspora composition to make its way to Jerusalem. Second, the literary aspects of the Book of Esther indicate that it was not written by the Jerusalem priestly community, but the figure of Nehemiah suggests that there was a second scribal community in Jerusalem, namely Judeans working for the Achaemenid administration. Their primary language would have been Aramaic, but growing nationalistic feelings in the late Persian, Hellenistic, and early Hasmonean periods made Hebrew increasingly important as a secondary language acquisition. However, Persian administrators, even those who were ethnically Judean, like Nehemiah, would not have been trained in the temple scribal community. The Book of Esther would have worked, however, marvelously as a curricular text for Judeans working in the Achaemenid administration to learn Hebrew. Thank you.